when was that? Back at Macquarie University?
At Menzies College.
Menzies College, years and years ago. Part of this will come up in the narrative here. Let me just say a bit about how I got to meet Tony, and then we'll come into more of where this is going tonight. But I've been trying to think through kind of a biblical theology. I've been very helped by someone called Meredith Klein with a K. You heard of Meredith?
Yeah.
Right? Amazing stuff. One of my most blessed mentors actually thought that Meredith was a bit nutty, and when I said I really liked him, he was quite shocked. I won't mention his name for that reason. But I think Meredith was probably a century ahead of his time, and he was just doing some great stuff. He was the first one who really helped me see the role of metaphor and image in what I now am pleased to call Israel's scriptures. So I probably should just put a little footnote there. I really don't like the word Old Testament, and I'm becoming increasingly pugnacious about that. First of all, if neither Jesus nor those who knew him best, Peter, James, John, Paul, who met him on the road to Damascus, if they never used that term, then who in a very hot place's name do we think we are to do something different? And I think what that's done actually is just harmed us in all kinds of ways, because all kinds of historical reasons for this too. People moving into the 1st and 2nd and 3rd century, and particularly if they're Hellenistic Christians, they have a certain view of the nature of truth, and for them Judaism, by the fact that it's very limited culturally, that it's past because the gospel has come, and for a few other reasons, basically regarded that as passé, and the gospel is this new universal thing. I think that's one of the reasons why they talked about the Old Testament, but I think it's a serious mistake they made, and we'll talk about more of that today. Anyway, so I've been trying to think through what it actually means to let Israel's scriptures set up its own categories for us. So I've done some sociology in my long journey toward adulthood. I'm probably still not there yet. I certainly don't behave like it. And that included doing some sociology and realizing that you can see every mountain except the one upon which you are standing. You can see every mountain except the one upon which you are standing. So we all know about water except for the fish, isn't it, right? So the idea there was to try and say, well, I've got all these preconceptions. I've grown up as a Christian. I've inherited all of those. What if I tried to let those go? I don't know that you can't actually do that entirely, but you can be conscious of it. What if I tried to let that go and let Scripture set up for me how I should approach things? And this is where it was just beginning. Meredith Klein helped me with this. So the notion of seeing creation as God's temple, very, very helpful. Some of the things he had to teach us on the image of God. And so at Macquarie, we started with that, right? What does it mean for creation to be God's temple? Well, a couple of things. We're not going to heaven. Heaven's coming. He would flow out of that. That there's something sacred about the physical world. Coming out of that, Christianity is really the true materialism. It doesn't force you to make a choice. You actually have both the spiritual and the material together, and both of them elevated. And I think you need both of those things. And it was in the context of talking about image. I think we were talking about the idea of God making us mini creators and what that might mean. And I think I had a little lament. Why is it that Christians are not known for being at the forefront of innovation and creativity and imagination? That kind of struck me as an interesting one. And I wonder, part of the talk tonight will be, I think it's the way we've chosen to talk about God that is in some ways intentionally or no, debilitated us in thinking creatively and with imagination. So, anyway, I gave a little talk at Macquarie, Menzies College, and this guy comes up and enfolds me in these huge arms. You ever had him stretch his arms? I mean, it's amazing. He should have played basketball. And I was thinking, my goodness, who's this? And remember, get me if I'm wrong here, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said something like, at last somebody who knows how to do theology, or something of that kind. And I'm thinking, okay, good. And then the next question was, I think, where are you staying this weekend or something? Anyway, we ended up forming this friendship that's really, I think, been very transformative in the way I've thought about Scripture. So very grateful for that. So that's the Mutual Admiration Society bit. It'll probably seep up on occasion, so just be prepared. Tonight, to get into this, I've just come back from the UK, and I was over there to work with the Bible Society and a couple of other places, thinking through what it meant for them to redefine themselves in the modern world. Right? They've got Bible Society, long history, incredible resources, but how in the world do they speak to the UK in the 20th century or 21st century? Oh, what happened there? Oh, Microsoft Word. We love you too. Yes, I actually run Microsoft Word on a Mac. It's the one app I have that doesn't work. Enough already. So we're in the UK, and a couple of things happened I think will serve as a nice way into this. The first one was when I got there, I was staying in Burford in the Cotswolds, and the Bible Society has this program they run where they offer scholarships to budding filmmakers. And they don't have to be Christian, but the script has to be in some way based on Scripture. And they'd awarded one of those, and it was being shot in Wales, about 2 hours away from where I was living, or staying at the time, and they arranged for a guy to pick me up in a semi-limo, not a really big one, but a nice one. And he was going to drive me out to Wales, and I'd be there for a couple of hours and watch them do the film shoot and talk to the director about the script and the producer, all that kind of stuff. And then I come home, right? So we're heading off, and I get chatting to him, as is my wont. I just find people really interesting. And we probably talked for 25 minutes about what he'd done, and it turned out he was an ex-IT consultant, and he loved restoring vehicles, and had just restored 3 German half-tracks from World War II, right? So I'm looking at Jeff because he restores not quite those kinds of things, but something similar. So, I happened to have an interest in that bit of history, so I talked about all of that, and then he got onto his broken marriage that hadn't worked, the relationship with his kids, and amazing how people open up. So that's a great conversation, and then he said, so what do you do, right? And this is always the tricky one, because your response can bring a conversation to a screaming halt if you're not careful, right? So you try to work out where people are. Like, saying you're a theologian doesn't always get things moving very quickly. People might get up and move. So I said, well, I have an interest in design and history of ideas, and how that relates to the first century, and they're all buzzwords, but you have to connect the dots. And I mentioned, well, I'm interested in the Bible as well and how that informed this. And he said, well, look, I don't want to pick a fight, but just so you know, I'm an atheist. I do not believe in God. I think religion, and the church in particular, is responsible for most of the trouble in the world. Right? Just saying, no fight, just saying. Okay, that's fine. And so he said, so what do you think about that? And I said, well, why don't you tell me why? And so he responded, and he gave me a little kind of postage stamp view of history, and I tried as kindly as I could to correct some of that. And after about, 15, 20 minutes of that exchange, I said to him, look, I don't want to keep going on about this. I don't want to bore you. And he said, oh, no, let's keep talking. We talked for 3 more hours. That's the rest of the way there and 2 hours coming back. And he said to me several times, you have completely fried my brain. So when he finally dropped me off at the Cotswolds, he jumped out of the car, came around, and he shook my hand, and he said, again, you completely fried my brain. I really have to think through all of this. I have so many questions. And then he said, and you need to make a documentary. People need to hear this, right? So I've been talking to the Bible Society about doing that, and that might be something good. And the basic thesis of that conversation was that the modern world is fundamentally Christian. And you can't be modern without being fundamentally Christian. It's just impossible. Now, for most people, being Christian means believing in Jesus, and of course it does, but that's a very limited view. It's an important part. Don't ever hear me downgrade that. I think Jesus is humongous. I think he's amazing. But he's much bigger than just the redemption, and it's a huge thing that this has opened up. And this guy couldn't believe it. I think the most shocking thing for him was he had a vision of religion in the church that he thought was opposed to life, trafficked in guilt and fear, to use Mark Strom's language. It was not about creativity. And as a result of our conversation, he discovered that the world he loved was actually the world that the Christian gospel had given him. And that's what completely threw him. Didn't know what to do with it. So We parted on very warm terms. I'm thinking, gee, that's amazing. I haven't really had an evangelistic moment like that for a while. Okay. And then, and that was one. And then a few days later, I'm travelling from Euston Station up to Birmingham New Street. Anyone like travelling on English trains?
Oh,
fantastic. Oh, brilliant. I love it, right? So I'm on this train heading up, and not too many people get on at Euston. There's an Italian guy who does. I don't know he's Italian until I start talking to him, as I do. He's got some breakfast. I don't have any. So we begin by a common lament over the state of English coffee, which is pretty miserable. So we talked about that, and then we got on to where he came from in Italy. I could tell from his accent. And then into cheeses and Italian wine, and we're having a great time celebrating all of this. And in fact, probably too much of a good time. I needed to get to work, and he wanted to keep talking. So anyway, I eventually managed to get to what we needed to do. But he's still intrigued. He keeps looking at me and, offering little comments and things, so that's good. Did I mention he's an engineer? Okay, so I discovered what he was doing. He was that. And about 20 minutes before we get to Birmingham New Street, he can see on the table at which we're sitting the spine of a book that was about Christian humanism, and he just caught the human bit. And he said, "Oh, so you work for a humanitarian society?" Now, by this time, the train's pretty full. Right? So there's a person, we're at a table, person sitting here, he's there, and then over on the side are two businessmen tapping away on their computers. And I say, well, it's not quite that. And now I'm thinking, how do I engage this guy in conversation? Now, a little footnote, I learned a lot from John's Gospel about how to do this. John's Gospel has the most extended stories of Jesus' engagement with people. There's fewer of them, but much more developed. And one thing that's really struck me is the way he really attends to where they are before he launches in. So he'll start where people are. And so I tried to start where this guy was, and I said, well, actually, no, I'm not really humanitarian, but I do things like I go to China to teach students in Chinese universities how to read the Bible because, I'm not going to jump in, the Chinese government's asked us to do this because they realised that Christianity was the engine of modernity. So I've got to get that whole sentence out before he gets a chance to go. Okay? Got to get that one on the table so he doesn't jump in at the wrong point. And he's like, what? Well, you asked. Okay? So the conversation began, and I'm trying to keep my voice down, but it becomes clear after a while that the person over here, this woman, is valiantly pretending to read her book, but she's not actually. I can tell. Her eyes are just, she hasn't turned a page in a while. And if you've ever been a lecturer, you might know you can see everything in that lecture room. You might think you're hiding tonight. You will be surprised how much we can see from up here, right? It's just, safety in numbers. No, there isn't. Right? And so I kept on talking a bit more, and eventually she just gives up. She just puts a book down and listens. And the two guys on the other side, they kind of stopped typing, and I realised I've got this audience of about 5 or 6 people in this part of it. Right? And just the kinds of things we talk about at gospel conversations, how the modern world with change, design, hope, transformation, all that stuff comes only from the gospel. Comes only from the gospel. And anyway, I got to Birmingham New Street, and we really hadn't got partway through the conversation. And I said, look, I'm really sorry, I have to go. He stood up, leaned over the table and shook my hand vigorously and said, I am so sorry I did not ask you what you did before. This is just mind-boggling. He said, I am so fascinated. Where do I get more? Well, unfortunately, we have neither the documentary nor the book yet, but let's hope we can get one coming. So all of that to say, I don't know about you, but for a lot of my life, I just did not know what to do with Jesus and the world around me. I knew it was real, what I experienced in church on a Sunday in prayer groups, but I had no idea how that moved into the larger world. And what Second Roads helped me see through Tony, but also what's this creation theology and a few other things, have helped me realise that actually I'd even make such strong statements as to say the Bible is the beating heart of modernity. That might sound like a really outrageous statement, but it certainly gets people's attention, right? Which is the point, right? So, what I'm planning to do over the next 3 sessions tonight is to try and get us all on the same page. So some of this you might have heard, some of it's going to be a review, some of it I hope will be new. But I need to have kind of a common foundation to move on to something in the next 2 sessions. that okay? It has to be. I have the microphone. Right? Good answer. I want you to watch this as we get in. Some of you might have seen it. It's a TED Talk.
For the past 10 years, I've been researching the way people organize and visualize information. There is an interesting shift. For a long period of time, we believed in a natural ranking order in the world around us, also known as the great chain of being, or scala natura in Latin. A top-down structure that normally starts with God at the very top, followed by angels, noblemen, common people, animals, and so on. This idea was actually based on Aristotle's ontology, which classified all things known to man in a set of opposing categories like the ones you see behind me. But over time, interestingly enough, this concept adopted the branching schema of a tree in what became known as the Porphyrian tree, also considered to be the oldest tree of knowledge. The branching scheme of the tree was in fact such a powerful metaphor for conveying information that it became over time an important communication tool to map a variety of systems of knowledge. We can see trees being used to map morality with its popular tree of virtues and tree of vices, as you can see here with these beautiful illustrations from medieval Europe. We can see trees being used to map consanguinity, the various blood ties between people. We can also see trees being used to map genealogy, perhaps the most famous archetype of the tree diagram. I think many of you in the audience have probably seen family trees. Many of you probably even have your own family trees drawn in such a way. We can see trees even mapping systems of law, the various decrees and rulings of kings and rulers. And finally, of course, also a very popular scientific metaphor, we can see trees being used to map all species known to man. And trees ultimately became such a powerful visual metaphor because in many ways they really embody this human desire for order, for balance, for unity, for symmetry. However, nowadays we're already facing new complex, intricate challenges that cannot be understood by simply employing a simple tree diagram. And a new metaphor is currently emerging, and it's currently replacing the tree in visualizing various systems of knowledge. It's really providing us with a new lens to understand the world around us. And this new metaphor is the metaphor of the network. And we can see this shift from trees into networks in many domains of knowledge. We can see this shift in the way we try to understand the brain. Well, before, we used to think of the brain as a modular, centralized organ where a given area was responsible for a set of actions and behaviors. The more we know about the brain, the more we think of it as a large music symphony played by hundreds and thousands of instruments. This is a beautiful snapshot created by the Blue Brain Project, where you can see 10,000 neurons and 30 million connections. And this is only mapping 10% of a mammalian neocortex. We can also see this shift in the way we try to conceive human knowledge. These are some remarkable trees of knowledge, or trees of science, by Spanish scholar Ramon Llull. And Llull was actually the precursor, the very first one, who created a metaphor of science as a tree, a metaphor we use every single day when we say biology is a branch of science, when we say genetics is a branch of science. But perhaps the most beautiful of all trees of knowledge, at least for me, was created for the French Encyclopedia by Diderot and d'Alembert in 1751. This was really the bastion of the French Enlightenment. And this gorgeous illustration was featured as a table of contents for the encyclopedia. And it actually illustrates, it maps out all domains of knowledge as separate branches of a tree. But knowledge is much more intricate than this. These are two maps of Wikipedia showing the interlinkage of articles related to history on the left and mathematics on the right. And I think by looking at these maps and the other ones that have been created on Wikipedia, arguably one of the largest rhizomatic structures ever created by man, we can really understand how human knowledge is much more intricate and interdependent, just like a network. We can also see this interesting shift in the way we map social ties between people. This is the typical organizational chart. I'm assuming many of you have seen a similar chart as well in your own corporations or others. It's a top-down structure that normally starts with the CEO at the very top, and where you can drill down all the way to the individual workman on the bottom. But humans sometimes are, well, actually, all humans are really unique in their own way. And sometimes we really don't play well under this really rigid structure. I think the internet is really changing this paradigm quite a lot. This is a fantastic map of online social collaboration between Perl developers. And Perl is a famous programming language, and here you can see how different programmers are actually exchanging files and working together on a given project. And here you can notice that this is a completely decentralized process. There's no leader in this organization. It's a network. We can also see this interesting shift when we look at terrorism. One of the main challenges of understanding terrorism nowadays is that we are dealing with decentralized, independent cells where there's no leader leading the whole process. And here you can actually see how visualization is being used. The diagram that you see behind me is showing all the terrorists involved in the Madrid attack in 2004. And what they did here is that they actually segmented the network into 3 different years, represented by the vertical layers that you see behind me. And the blue lines tie together the people that were present in that network year after year. So even though there's no leader per se, these people are probably the most influential ones in that organization, the ones that know more about the past and the future plans and goals of this particular cell. We can also see this shift from trees into networks in the way we classify and organize species. The image on the right is the only illustration that Darwin included in the Origin of Species, which Darwin called the tree of life. And there's actually a letter from Darwin to the publisher expanding on the importance of this particular diagram. It was critical for Darwin's theory of evolution. But recently, scientists discovered that overlaying this tree of life is a dense network of bacteria. This bacteria is actually tied together species that were completely separated before. It's what scientists are now calling not the tree of life, but the web of life, the network of life. And finally, we can really see this shift, again, when we look at ecosystems around our planet. No more do we have these simplified predator versus prey diagrams we have all learned at school. This is a much more accurate depiction of an ecosystem. This is a diagram created by Professor David Levine, mapping close to 100 species that interact with the codfish off the coast of Newfoundland in Canada. I think here we can really understand the intricate and interdependent nature of most ecosystems that are bound to our planet. But even though recent, this metaphor, the metaphor of the network, is really already adopting various shapes and forms. And it's almost becoming a growing visual taxonomy. It's almost becoming the syntax of a new language. And this is one aspect that truly fascinates me. And these are actually 15 different typologies I've been collecting over the time. And it really shows the immense visual diversity of this new metaphor. And here's an example. The first, on the very top band, you have radial convergence, a model, visualization model that has become really popular over the last 5 years. And the top left, the very first project, is a gene network, followed by a network of IP addresses, machine servers, followed by a network of Facebook friends. You probably couldn't find more disparate topics, yet they are using the same metaphor, the same visual model to map the inherent complexities of its own subject. And here are a few more examples of the many I've been collecting of this growing visual taxonomy of networks. But networks are not just a scientific metaphor. As designers, researchers, and scientists try to map a variety of complex systems, they are in many ways influencing traditional art fields like painting and sculpture, and influencing many different artists. And perhaps because networks have this huge aesthetical force to them, they're immensely gorgeous, they are really becoming a cultural meme and driving a new art movement, which I've called networkism. And we can see this influence in this movement in a variety of ways. This is just one of many examples where you can see this influence from science into art. The example on your left side is IP mapping, a computer-generated map of IP addresses against servers, machines. And on your right side, you have transient structures and unstable networks. by Sharon Malloy, using all and animal on canvas. And here are a few more paintings by Sharon Malloy, some gorgeous, intricate paintings. And here's another example of that interesting cross-pollination between science and art. On your left side, you have Operation Smile. It is a computer-generated map of a social network. And on your right side, you have Field 4 by Emma McNally, using only graphite on paper. Emma McNally is one of the main leaders of this movement, and she creates these striking imaginary landscapes where you can really notice the influence from traditional network visualization. But networkism doesn't happen only in 2 dimensions. This is perhaps one of my favorite projects of this new movement, and I think the title really says it all. It's called Galaxies Forming Along Filaments Like Droplets Along the Strands of a Spider's Web. And I just find this particular project being immensely powerful. It was created by Thomas Arasano, and he occupies these large spaces, creates these massive installations using only elastic ropes. As you actually navigate that space and bounce in one of those elastic ropes, the entire network kind of shifts, almost like a real organic network would. And here's yet another example of networkism taken to a whole different level. This was created by Japanese artist Shiharu Shiota in a piece called In Silence. And Shiharu, like Thomas Arasano, fills these rooms with this dense network, dense web of elastic ropes and black wool and thread, sometimes including objects, as you can see here, sometimes even including people in many of her installations. But networks are also not just a new trend, and it's too easy for us to dismiss it as such. Networks really embody notions of decentralization, of interconnectedness, of interdependence. And this new way of thinking is critical for us to solve many of the complex problems we are facing nowadays, from decoding the human brain to understanding the vast universe out there. On your left side, you have a snapshot of a neural network of a mouse, very similar to our own at this particular scale. And on your right side, you have the Millennium Simulation. It was the largest and most realistic simulation of the growth of cosmic structure. It was able to recreate the history of 20 million galaxies in approximately 25 terabytes of output. And coincidentally or not, I just find this particular comparison between the smallest scale of knowledge, the brain, and the largest scale of knowledge, the universe itself, to be really, really quite striking and fascinating. Because as Bruce Mao once said, when everything is connected to everything else, for better or worse, everything matters. Thank you so much.
Okay, so wakey wakey, why do you think I showed you that tonight? What might this have to do with talking about God, theology, design?
Getting rid of our old models and starting to rethink in new ways.
Rethinking how God has designed things. I mean, that's the whole scientific project in the early scientific revolution is thinking God's thoughts after him. Well, I think this is an attempt at that.
Yeah,
It's a replacement of a top-down.
it is, isn't it? Yeah.
So it's breaking up the silos of different forms of knowledge.
Yep.
The metaphors we choose are all pervasive.
Yeah. They're all good, and I have to say, I'm not actually at the end of this journey by any stretch. It's one of the great things about the R&D exercise of gospel conversations. We can kind of explore this, right? But I've raised for a couple of reasons. One is, I'd like to think about what this means for actually doing theology. And I'm going to, if I have to, well, put some cards on the table now. If I had to compare what I've learnt reading Scripture, becoming more aware of how that works in terms of biblical theology, and the way I was first introduced to doing theology many, many years ago through a certain well-known systematics textbook, I could kind of align one approach with one aspect demonstrated here and another approach with another aspect. But we'll come back to that in just a moment. All right? So I think this does have implications of how we think about God and how we talk about Him. It's going to require some change. And secondly, just in terms of where I want to go tonight, at least to get started here, I'm always interested in why people ask the questions they do. Right? So it's one thing to say, oh, you know, that person came to a wrong conclusion. Much more interesting for me to ask, well, why did they? What lay behind that? Right? And so I'm doing that with myself, actually. I may well be coming to a wrong conclusion, but what I'm trying to do as we get started is just to talk about some of the things in my own life that have given rise to these kinds of questions, if that can help you. So in biblical studies these days, it's kind of the appropriate thing to do to say where you're coming from, rather than simply sitting down and writing a book, because everyone recognises everyone has a perspective. So this is something about mine. And it's a network of experiences. And no, this is not me. I'm going to keep my shirt on. That's okay. So just in terms of my own life, I'm charismatic, Pentecostal. I've actually experienced God do some amazing things, been involved in things I could only call miraculous healing. So I actually don't like the word miracle, but that's another conversation.
Semi-miraculous.
Pardon?
Semi-miraculous.
Oh, well, I think John would call them signs, and the synoptics would call them mighty deeds. So I participated in a few mighty deeds, right? That have gone beyond any ability to explain this, and I knew that was real. I have tremendous memories as a young person encountering God's presence, just transformative, right? And you can't put it into words. Any more than you can try and describe a good Shiraz. I mean, you can't do it. Is that those tasting notes? What a load of old cobblers. I mean, who are they trying to kid? They don't even come close, right? So how do you talk about those hugely formative things? I had a number of those, but I'm an engineer, right? So I know about math or maths, depending what side of the pond you come from. And that was one of my great shocks, I think. I loved aircraft and discovered it was all about mathematics, which is a bit of a disillusioning moment. But as I've said to people, what's a turbofan at 30,000 feet got to do with what was going on in my Christian experience? I really couldn't tie those things together. And then the whole faith versus reason thing. I thought the solution was for me to go to La Trobe University and do a course in philosophy, one in sociology and one in art history, right? So I need to somehow sort this out, and of course, you know, once you're in that realm, you're doing the whole faith versus reason thing, you know, in search of truth. And I personally find that distinction very unhelpful. When the disciples are in the boat and they see Jesus tell the storm what to do, there's no faith. They're scared spitless, or something that sounds like that, right? But there's no faith involved. And when Moses is there at the foot of the mountain, there's no faith involved in that. It's exactly the same epistemology as Galileo turning his telescope to the moon and going, oh my goodness, it's not perfect. It's exactly that same kind of epistemology. And a lot of these guys who do reason, actually, as you would know, having done, if you've listened to Edwin's talks, go down the pure reason road, you never get science. So that's the positive of the so-called faith side. It's not really faith at all. A lot of it's experience. It might be trust in terms of eyewitness testimony, trusting what other people tell you. But it's certainly not disembodied faith versus some kind of perfect abstract reasoning. And then Paul, on the other hand, is an amazing thinker. The more I've got to read through Paul in Romans, I mean, this guy is as sharp as three tacks. He's phenomenal. My area is actually how the New Testament makes use of Israel's scriptures. Right? And when you watch Paul in Romans 9 through 11, he's just on song. I mean, some verses, there's 3 references to Israel's scriptures. And you go back and look at what's going on, and he's this maestro. He's plucking all these different streams of God's relationship with his people and welding them, bringing them together in this amazing tapestry. Okay? He's really a sharp guy, so it's not about that. Right? I think that's to misconstrue the whole thing. There's got to be another way of talking about the distinction. And part of my journey into that was this whole philosophy versus history thing. So I took a class in philosophy and actually did end up throwing in my faith for a while there. Right? Until a couple of things happened in that process. I was doing art history and I realised philosophy could never help me understand what I enjoyed about Chagall. You know, like Chagall? Mm-hmm. Right? And it could never help me. And I thought, okay, that's a problem. Right? And then I have to confess, there was a band once called Little River Band. They came and played at La Trobe, and I had my first experience. Okay? And I remember sitting there thinking, I've been in prayer meetings that are better than this. What in the world am I doing? And I had been. I knew prayer meetings in my background when we thought we'd been praying for 15 minutes and we've been praying for 2 hours. Just incredible sense of God's presence. And I had to make a choice. Was I going to go with what people tell me could only be true, or what I myself had actually experienced? And in the end, I went with my experience. I was going to go with my love for Chagall, whether philosophy could tell me about it or not. Right? So really what was going on there, the combination of these factors, realization that there are different grammars for talking about different kinds of things. So Qantas, yes, hope they see this. I'm a frequent flyer. Give me some extra points, please. And then, of course, is Chagall, and then philosophy, so engineering, art history, philosophy. You can talk about each one of those things. They have particular grammar for each discourse, but that doesn't mean they're transferable. So how do they relate? What makes sense of the person who's doing the thinking in the middle of all of this? Right? So coming out of the different grammars then, Tony's alluded to this. How does religious language work in modernity? And I think that was a reference to redemption. When I'm on the train talking to this guy, or in the cab, the limo, talking to the ex-IT consultant about what life is, I'm pretty sure if I'd started with redemption, I wouldn't have got anywhere near the response I got when I was actually dealing with the modern world in which he lived. So that's partly what's been driving this discussion. If this God stuff is real, it ought to be able to speak to the world I'm in. And if it can't do that, I'm kidding myself. So I wonder if our religious language has somehow been part of the problem in silencing our ability to talk about what God really has been doing, to try and find new language to do that. Then fixity versus strategy. If I think about my education, I don't think in my, what have I done? Forgive me, I've done 2 master's degrees, one in Old Testament, one in New Testament. That was about, I don't know, all up 4.5 years of study or something. I don't think I ever heard the word strategy mentioned once in biblical studies classes or my traditional theology classes. And the thing that shocks me is I never actually asked that question until I met somebody who talked about strategy. And you see what that is? It's the stuff you don't know that you want to be worried about, right? The people who don't know what they don't know. And that's what was going on here. It just never occurred to me to even ask, why is that word not there? Given that strategy is so part of what our world's currently about. And then I realised that so much of what I was doing in my traditional systematic classes were description. It was all about fixity. Nothing moved. And so where does design come into that? Because that's usually what makes us who we are. So yeah, you might have heard of John McMurray. Some of you have. He was critiquing, I had his name, Descartes, right? Descartes, cogito, ergo sum, I think. Therefore I am, right? Whether that's true or not is another question. That, might be in tautology. But over against him, humans are not just thinkers. We're actually agents. And the more you think about how you learn things, like we train people in apprenticeships. One of the things they did with us as engineers is put us back into the factory for a bit. So we're actually agents, not just thinkers. And agency is actually about creativity. So by agency, I don't mean I'm acting as someone else's agent. I'm acting as an agent of change or something. And that language never really emerged in my theological education, which really raises this question for me as we're thinking about theology. Why do they look so different? And I know this sounds like an age-old debate. It's not really. It's been around for a while. I think Tertullian was basically asking questions about that. One of his critiques of a famous 2nd century heretic was this heretic had a problem with things actually coming into being in the material world, and Tertullian said, but that's history, that's what happened, deal with it. Right? So that emphasis on history as opposed to more philosophical theology is not new. It's already going back to the end of the 2nd century and into the 3rd. So This is not just some kind of modern invention. You know, you kind of get these pseudo-new evangelicals where it's kind of cool to kick, you know, the reform can or something, because that's what we all do. It's our adult equivalent of growing our hair long and having a tat. That's kind of our sophisticated version of doing that. Does that sound all right? Because it is sometimes, isn't it? Okay, I know I'm being a bit cheeky, but it can be that, right? And it gets dismissed as that, and we don't want it to be that. I think these are really important questions. So can I say these are not places to work out our angst because we're rebelling against a church that's been frustrating for us. If that's the exercise, please go home. Right? We don't need you around this movement. You're going to give us a bad name, right? We don't want to do that. We're really trying to wrestle with what everyone can see, and there's a difference between these two things. William Tyndale recognised that when he was at Oxford. One of the reasons he left Oxford and went to Cambridge, always a good move, I think, in the 50s. Was because he was sick and tired of learning more about Aristotle than he was about Scripture. And again, I'm just trying to draw attention to the fact that we are not the first who recognise there's a difference. And you can tell that. There is a difference between the way Scripture's been put together and the way we tend to do theology, okay? And just pick up your theological textbook and it's different, isn't it? So I'm not trying to ask this in a pugilistic kind of way. I'm just interested as a sociologist as to why do they look different? Because it's not a neutral decision. Okay? It's not a neutral decision. Behind these ways of describing things are certain assumptions, certain preconceived ideas about the nature of truth, the nature of God, how you talk about it, how you come to know it, etc., etc. Okay? So I want to show you, can we show you another clip, or do you want to take a short break for a few seconds? Another clip? Okay. So some of you heard of Ian McGilchrist, had anything to do with Regent, you know about him, a few of you have, okay. I found him quite helpful. So here's a short clip where he talks and this guy draws pictures, and when that's done, you'll probably want to go see it again, and I can tell you where to do that. But then I'll briefly go just through some summaries of what he talked about, and then there'll be time for discussion and a short break. Is that okay? Yeah. So what we talked about so far is, this whole thing is about theology, God, design, how that all fits together. And we began by talking about the shift in the way human beings organise knowledge. Right, so we're moving from top down now to more trees, to interconnections and networks. And the question behind that is, what might that mean for us as to how we should think about who God is? And of course, we're not the first ones to think about God. We've got Scripture. And then, you know, for me, I'm thinking, okay, given where that world was, what does Scripture look more like, top down or more networked? I think it looks more networked. So the implication behind this then is, who actually got it right? Did God get it right the first time? Or did he really need us to come along and help him sort this thing out to bring clarity where he actually missed stuff? Now, I happen to have a high view of God, and I find that kind of attitude profoundly arrogant, if you forgive me saying it. It makes me really stroppy, actually. Good Australian word I can say here, and you get it. It doesn't work in Canada. I mean, seriously, to think that we can improve on, like, really? Really? And it happens actually not even in the time of Jesus, poor fellow, right? He hasn't quite escaped this kind of more narrative approach for children. That's okay for Sunday school, but for the really intelligent people, we really have to wait for the 3rd and 4th century when at last we can get to do this. Is that what we're really saying? My seminary training was about that. You did your biblical studies work in order to feed this project. And again, that's not a neutral decision. Okay? So maybe to give us, put a little more edge if I haven't already, with words like profoundly arrogant. Okay? Let's watch this clip of Ian McGilchrist. Thank you, Tony, on the last one.
The division of the brain is something neuroscientists don't like to talk about anymore. It enjoyed a sort of popularity in the 60s and 70s after the first split brain operations, and it led to a sort of popularization which has since been proved to be entirely false. It's not true that one part of the brain does reason and the other does emotion. Both are profoundly involved in both. It's not true that language resides only in the left hemisphere. It doesn't. Important aspects are in the right. It's not true that visual imagery is only in the right hemisphere. Lots of it is in the left. And so in a sort of fit of despair, people have given up talking about it. But the problem won't really go away, because this organ, which is all about making connection, is profoundly divided. It's there inside all of us, and it's got more divided over the course of human evolution, so that the ratio of the corpus callosum to the volume of the hemispheres has got smaller over evolution. And the plot thickens when you realize that one of the main, if not the main, function of the corpus callosum is in fact to inhibit the other hemisphere. So something very important is going on here about keeping things apart from one another. And not only that, the brain is profoundly asymmetric. It's broader at the back on the left and broader on the right at the front, and slightly juts forward and backward. And it's as though somebody got hold of the brain from underneath and given it a sort of sharp twist clockwise. What is all that about? If one just needed more brain space, one would do it symmetrically. The skull is symmetrical. The box in which all this is contained is symmetrical. Why go to trouble to expand some bits of one hemisphere and some bits of another, unless they were doing rather different things? What are they doing? Well, it's not just we who have these divided brains. Birds and animals have them as well. I think the simplest way to think of it is if you imagine a bird trying to feed on a seed against the background of grit or pebbles. It's got to focus very narrowly and clearly on that little seed and be able to pick it out against that background. But it's also, if it's going to stay alive, it's got to actually keep a quite different kind of attention open. It's got to be on the lookout for predators or for friends, on specifics, but for whatever else is going on. And it seems that birds and animals quite reliably use their left hemisphere for this narrow focused attention to something it already knows is of importance to it. And they keep their right hemisphere vigilant broadly for whatever might be without any commitment as to what that might be. And they also use their right hemispheres for making connections with the world, so that they approach their mates and bond with their mates more using the right hemisphere. But then you come to the humans, and it's true that actually in humans too this kind of attention is one of the big differences. The right hemisphere gives sustained, broad, open vigilance, alertness, where the left hemisphere gives narrow, sharply focused attention to detail. And people who lose their right hemispheres have a pathological narrowing of the window of attention. But humans are different. The big thing about humans is their frontal lobes. And the purpose of that part of the brain? To inhibit the rest of the brain, to stop the immediate happening. So standing back in time and space from the immediacy of experience. And that enables us to do two things. It enables us to do what neuroscientists are always telling us we're very good at, which is outwitting the other party, being Machiavellian. And that's interesting to me, because that's absolutely right. We can read other people's minds and intentions, and if we so want to, we can deceive them. But the bit that's always curiously missed out here is that it also enables us to empathize for the first time, because there's a sort of necessary distance from the world. If you're right up against it, you just bite. But if you can stand back and see that other individual is an individual like me, who might have interests and values and feelings like mine, then you can make a bond. There's a sort of necessary distance, as there is in reading. Too close, you can't see anything. Too far, you can't read it. So the distance from the world that is provided is profoundly creative of all that is human, both the Machiavellian and the Erasmian. Now, to do the Machiavellian stuff, to manipulate the world, which is very important, we need to be able to interact with the world and use it for our benefit. Food is the starting point, but we also, with our left hemispheres, grasp, using our right hands, things and make tools. We also use that part of language to grasp things, as we say. It pins them down. So when we already know something's important and we want to be precise about it, we use our left hemispheres in that way. And to do that, we need a simplified version of reality. It's no good if you're fighting a campaign having all the information on all the plant species that grow in the terrain of battle. What you need is to know the specifics of where certain things are that matter to you, and so you have a map and you have little flags. It's not reality, but it works better. The newness of the right hemisphere makes it a devil's advocate. It's always on the lookout for things that might be different from our expectations. It sees things in context. It understands implicit meaning, metaphor, body language, emotional expression in the face. It deals with an embodied world, in which we stand embodied in relation to a world that is concrete. It understands individuals, not just categories. It actually has a disposition for the living rather than the mechanical. And this is so marked that even in a left-hander who is actually using their right hemisphere in daily life to manipulate tools with their left hand, it is their left hemisphere, not their right hemisphere, in which tools and machines are coded. So this is very interesting. And it changes the view of the body. The body becomes an assemblage of parts in the left hemisphere. If I had to sum it all up, I would get away from all those things that we used to say, reason and imagination. Let me make it very clear. For imagination, you need both hemispheres. Let me make it very clear. For reason, you need both hemispheres. So if I had to sum it up, I'd say the world of the left hemisphere, dependent on denotative language and abstraction, yields clarity and power to manipulate things that are known, fixed, static, isolated, decontextualized, explicit, general in nature, but ultimately lifeless. The right hemisphere, by contrast, yields a world of individual, changing, evolving, interconnected, implicit, incarnate, living beings within the context of the lived world, but in the nature of things never fully graspable, never perfectly known. And to this world it exists in a certain relationship. The knowledge that's mediated by the left hemisphere is, however, within a closed system. It has the advantage of perfection, but the perfection is bought ultimately at the price of emptiness. There's a problem here about the nature of the two worlds. They offer us two versions of the world, and obviously we combine them in different ways all the time. We need to rely on certain things to manipulate the world, but for a broad understanding of it, we need to use knowledge that comes from the right hemisphere. And it's my suggestion to you that in the history of Western culture, things started in the 6th century BC, in the Augustan era, and in the 15th, 16th century in Europe, with a wonderful balancing of these hemispheres. But in each case, it drifted further to the left hemisphere's point of view. Nowadays, we live in a world which is paradoxical. We pursue happiness, and it leads to resentment, and it leads to unhappiness, and it leads, in fact, to an explosion of mental illness. We've pursued freedom, but we now live in a world which is more monitored by CCTV cameras, and in which our daily lives are more subjected to what de Tocqueville called a network of small, complicated rules that cover the surface of life and strangle freedom. More information, we have it in spades, but we get less and less able to use it, to understand it, to be wise. There's a paradoxical relationship, as I know as a psychiatrist, between adversity and fulfillment, between restraint and freedom, between the knowledge of the parts and wisdom about the whole. A machine model, again, that is supposed to answer everything, but it doesn't. Think about this. Even rationality is grounded in a leap of intuition. There is no way you can rationally prove that rationality is a good way to look at the world. We intuit that it is very helpful. And this is not new. At the other end of the process, rationality, we know from Gödel's theorem, we know from what Pascal was saying hundreds of years before Gödel, that the end point of rationality is to demonstrate the limits to rationality. In our modern world, we've developed something that looks awfully like the left hemisphere's world. We prioritize the virtual over the real. The technical becomes important. Bureaucracy flourishes. The picture, however, is fragmented. There's a loss of uniqueness. The how has become subsumed in what. And the need for control leads to a paranoia in society that we need to govern and control everything. Why this shift? I think there are three reasons. One is the left hemisphere's talk is very convincing because it shaved everything that it doesn't find fits with its model off and cut it out. So this particular model is entirely self-consistent, largely because it's made itself so. I also call the left hemisphere the Berlusconi of the brain, because it controls the media. It's the one with which it's very vocal on its own behalf. The right hemisphere doesn't have a voice, and it can't construct these same arguments. And I also think, rather more importantly, there's a sort of hall of mirrors effect. The more we get trapped into this, the more we undercut and ironize things that might have led us out of it. And we just get reflected back into more of what we know about what we know about what we know. And I just want to make it clear, I'm not against whatever it is the left hemisphere has to offer. Nobody could be more passionate in an age in which we neglect reason and we neglect careful use of language. Nobody could be more passionate than myself about language and about reason. It's just that I'm even more passionate about the right hemisphere and the need to return what that knows to a broader context. It turned out that Einstein's thinking somehow presaged this thing about the structure of the brain. He said, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant, but has forgotten the gift.
Okay. So, quiz time. Everyone got that today? You can actually find that on Vimeo. Just look up McGilchrist, Master, Emissary, and you can watch it to your heart's content. Okay. So, very quick summary then. He wants to take the physiology of the brain seriously. I like that. It's not just theory, and they've actually done tests with people who are right brain damaged, and when they draw pictures of a cube, all they get the lines right, but none of them are connected. So there is scientific evidence behind this. So essentially the argument then, two sides of the brain, both important, both need to be talking to one another. It's not making a choice between one or the other. They both need to interact. But here's a world of isolation, right? If you like, narrow focus, and in doing so excludes things. On the other hand, right brain is like a broad, he doesn't use this metaphor, but I think it works, a wide angle camera lens where everything's in focus but without judgment. You just see all the stuff that's there. And so what that results in are two worlds, and one world, abstraction, precision, but decontextualized, fixed, static isolation certainly leads to clarity, no question about that, but its perfection comes at the risk of being empty and even lifeless. So I've sat in some theology classes that had exactly that impact on me, to be really honest. Not all of them, certain kinds of it. Okay? On the other hand, those of you who are working in scripture will know now with people's understanding of narrative and literature and metaphor, richly textured, deeply personal, culturally embedded narratives, a world of the individual, the personal, characterized by what the implicit, room for change, growth, interconnection. It's fundamentally about incarnation and living beings in a lived world. So they're the two features of the right and left brain bring to the equation, if you like. And so in one sense, there's final distinction. Okay? All right, so let's have some brief discussion time. You've got time to do that? Just so throw things open for a bit. Why don't you talk to the person next to you? We'll give you 5 minutes to comment on some of this, and then we'll have some input from everybody. Okay, so off you go. If you need to go to the bathroom, you can do that too, but you have to chat in the bathroom.
Same here. I think it's interesting.
Oh, you only the image you've got there for.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, I was flying from Vancouver down to Dallas to give some talks, and I happened to sit next to a guy and his wife, and he, as we got chatting, as is our want, he introduced himself as a Marxist sociologist. Right? Not too many of those left in the US, I think. Maybe resurgent, I don't know. And so then he said to me, so what are you going to do, down to Dallas? So right answer, how do I respond to that? And I said, I was interested in ancient Near Eastern creation stories and their shape on culture. Right? Does that work? And he said, oh, that's fascinating. So we got talking about that, and I talked about Egyptian temples modeling the cosmos and the role of the image inside of the image of the god. And then I said, there's one group in the ancient Near East who do not have a physical image in their temple. He's a sociologist, he's interested, right? And I said, and it's the Jews. Now, before, don't give too much space for them to come with a whole barrage of questions, make your next point, right? And I talked about that's why they had such a high morality, if you like, because they believed, and I'd explained already what you did to the image you did to the god, which is why the priests did what they did in their temples. But you say that of every human being, and it's going to radically transform your culture. I tell you no lie, I was sitting right there, he turned to his wife and said, honey, we need to start going back to church. So I've had that experience a couple of times. Guy at Regent was doing some writing on this topic for me, and I'd done some recording, and his dad's a non-Christian and drives cabs in Toronto. And he listened to this first section on creation as a temple with all this Egyptian background, and he said to his son, how do I get more of this? I can't believe it. This is incredible, right? But the reason that works is because it's incarnated in people's history. It's not some kind of abstract. So you're right, image of God in itself doesn't mean much, but lots of people are interested in the history of ideas, I've found, especially make it attractive. Next thing can be off and running. So
Can I
please,
just challenge the image of God one? I began talking about Gregory of Nyssa, and as you've been listening, if you go into this book, it's astonishing. It was written in 374. If he had McGilchrist, he would have helped him. Yeah. But he takes enormously seriously, in breathtaking terms, exactly what McGilchrist, because as far as he's concerned, we are studying God. As far as Gregory is concerned, reason, I'm studying God. Only in the creation of men did the Godhead take counsel, because I'm going to reflect myself on it. And as the book unfolds, Gregory's book unfolds, he just goes in more and more and more detail about us, why we have hands, rather than on 4 feet, because the hands free the face up to be constructed, not with a great, like a bear that needed to eat. Our hands eat, and they therefore construct the face so that the face can reverberate language, so we can, and he just goes on and on and on in the qualities that let us be. His number one word in describing us the image of God is royal. That's the first word he uses, that we are made for royalty. Wow. Now, royalty means rule, and McGilchrist has talked about rule. How through our thinking we rule, and good and bad ways to rule. And so to actually go into what makes us as human beings so godlike and capable of ruling is extremely important. Now, just as an example, because this is so much part of my world. Today, this afternoon, I won't say the name of the client, very big. Young woman there, very significant role in the organisation. I'm encouraging her to be very innovative. She's going to take risks, that's how we help. But and I was telling her my 2 road story. I said, understand the difference between a left brain view of the world and the right brain view of the world. If you're into analytics, we are looking at effects in order to infer causes. I said, that's lean, that's business process re-engineering. So if you go to creativity, understand the paradigm shift. We become the first cause of new reality. I said, I want you to seep that in, because, and I always use exactly the same next sentence, we play God and initiate new realities. And you can they get goosebumps. So what you're talking about here is, and McGilchrist is talking about, is the mystery of the power of the mind, that what lets us do that. I mean, I won't go into it now, but McGilchrist didn't really go into it, but he talked about the frontal lobe, and the fact that the frontal lobe lets me be dramatic, as Jackson Browne said in a great line from a song years ago, you watch yourself from the sidelines like life is a game you don't mind playing. And we watch ourselves doing things, and that's that separation he talked about. And that separation is only that which is consciousness, which is the sine qua non of humanity. Only because of that can you create. Because you separate yourself from yourself and you start to manipulate the other bits. You are now designing. If you're not designing, you're the dog biting. Does that make it? Yeah. You have to separate yourself from yourself to watch yourself to play. Yeah. It's the only way we make a new thing. And so the tremendous power of this ability to create and the cognitive faculties, which he's brilliant at, describing it. Let us do it. We are now kind of treading on holy ground.
Absolutely.
Very
So
exciting.
when you separate yourself from there, then you connect to something that gives you these new ideas. You go, where did I get this from?
You do
You
get
didn't
into a
know
flow.
this.
Well, you get into a flow.
Yeah.
A connection.
Something you might have never known, suddenly you know it, and it's actually, how is it? So amazing.
Intuition. It's great.
Thank you. Anyone else?
It was interesting chatting about looking at the Good Chris model and some of the work that Carmel does in helping clients integrate that kind of left brain, right brain thinking in creating more whole persons. But one of the things that it strikes me is that a good deal of theology that at least I've been raised on is very left brain oriented.
Yeah.
It's systematics, categories, pseudo-logical or pseudo-scientific, and thoroughly dull and dead. And I was just thinking back to that kind of distinction that Nietzsche makes between the dynamism and polony, and the balance between the passionate, creative, and then the ordered and the structured, and how kind of uniting those two together is what really births new things. And thinking, how on earth do we do that in the classroom?
John's first mighty deed is to have the Logos turning water into wine and a wedding. All kinds of wonderful resonances there. Yes.
The first video that you showed brought out the significance of taking a three-dimensional approach to the connections and to acknowledge that there are far more planes on which interactions occur. And I think that's great. I think the real challenge is how do you extract from that more articulated image something that actually is purposeful and significant for us. The way that one approach to it is to look for patterns, which will change your view of reality, because you'll start to see patterns emerging that you didn't expect to see, and connections that mean something because of your experience with over time. Looking at those new connections, something will start to emerge which will allow you to make decisions based on information useful for decision making. Okay, that's intelligence. That's extracting. I'm not sure how I move that into the Christian experience. Certainly from a personal view, and Tony knows this, looking for new connections, even in our reading of the Bible, is transformational. And what you're talking about with creation theology is in fact making extracting a pattern from new connections that otherwise we weren't familiar with or didn't see before. I find that very, very useful, very, very satisfying. I don't know. How do you recognise patterns that are there and that don't jump out, and which probably add to that continual enlargement, mental enlargement, as you recognise new patterns in connections that you hadn't recognised before, or maybe seen but didn't give meaning to.
Is that a rhetorical question or a?
It's a challenge. It's a challenge for me, and maybe.
As Rikk was, as you were talking, going through the neural network fuzzy world, out of which a pattern emerges versus the very nice tidy tree diagram. Is a really eerie thing, and I'm still chasing after the answer to this question: what is such holy ground about design? Because it certainly is holy ground, and it's contested, but it's not owned by Christians. That's the. We could interpret it better than anyone else, but we don't own it. So when I two questions, two little stories here on practicalities. I was talking at a major design conference in Cleveland, and there was 100 designers there, and I was one of 3 keynote speakers at the beginning. And I talked, and another guy talked who was fascinating. It was all about design and design thinking. And whenever you talk about design thinking, because it's a big thing in the management world, it splits into 2 camps very quickly. And this happened to me when I led a course in Chicago recently with Accenture people. Half the room think, oh, I could learn that in a 2-week course. I didn't do that. It just goes bang, bang, bang. Yeah, I got it. It's great. But look, frankly, IBM got design thinking. And the other half of the room is like the right brain, like seething and saying, it's a new paradigm. It's a new it's you know, and searching for, they see the profundity behind it. And this second speaker, who was, he just gave a talk I've never forgotten, who said, well, if we think you can teach design, he said, I'll take you back to the Cappadocian Fathers and the Gospel. And he, for somehow or other, saw in the 4th century a bifurcation in the Christian church between those who thought we can codify it all, turn it into protocols and frameworks and control the whole show very nicely, versus the Cappadocian Fathers, of whom Gregory of Nyssa was one of the leaders, who preserved the mystery. And he went to John's Gospel as an example of what which essentially says, look, I'm sorry, I can't codify this. You're going to have to jump in and experience it, and out of the mystery make sense. I'm not going to take the mystery away. And there's an enormous desire by society and the left brain to take the mystery away, and you've got to resist it. So this afternoon, I mean, we're doing a major project with Japanese counterparts, right? So it's going to be a lot of fun, but it's a huge transformation project. And the Japanese, God bless them, are so keen to learn design thinking. So we're on the phone and the conversation goes, can we, I can't do that, a Japanese accent. Segment, can you explain step 2, segment markets? How do you segment markets? What is the criteria? We say, well, it just depends. I mean, you can't until you sort of, we don't know how we're going to segment the markets, and neither should you know. You're just going to have to experience it. That's what my colleagues say. You're going to have to experience it. And as you experience it, you don't know what's going to happen, but you know, stuff's going to come out, and they're really confused.
They want to know.
So we gave an example. My colleague gave an example. Said, well, look, we've just done this large kind of project, and we had these psychographic categories, like, you know, she mentioned one of the 3 was frozen by fear, right? And because we, in this particular kind of service industry, we saw a lot of customers were frozen by fear, you know. And I said to the Japanese, look, there's no way knowing that you walk in knowing I'm going to find a group of people who are frozen by fear, but that's very meaningful. But they were so struggling. But it was, the whole time I was thinking of the simplicity and clarity, because if I give you the tree diagram, I give you the 6 points, then you don't think you have to learn anything else. But in fact, you're going to make a big mess of it. And I'm not, and I know in myself that, you know, I'm no longer threatened by it. When I was younger, I was threatened. People say, but if you understood, you could explain it to me. Why can't you explain it to me? And the fear of ambiguity, a lot of managers are like this. Like, they ask for a vision and we've got to be able to give it to them. No, we don't. Say, sorry, I'm not giving you a vision. I don't know myself. I'm not going to relieve you of ambiguity. That's life, right? Just get used to it. And the fact that I'm in ambiguity doesn't mean I'm out of control here, right? So I think this sort of dynamic between the right and the left brain and design thinking around the networks versus clarity pervades all of life.
I just had a self-referential moment. Just had a few days over in New Zealand, looking at leadership in Samuel, and I have to, you know, whenever I hear people wanting to do leadership in something, I just about die. Actually, horrible. So I said, no, we're just going to work through Samuel, and if there are bits that fall from the tables, you do that. That's great. One of the things that comes out from that is just how much ambiguity there is, and one of the laments that Bible people have had with some of their colleagues on the other side of the table has been they want to get rid of ambiguity. And it seems to me the Bible doesn't do that for you, which I think is what makes it so rich, because life is ambiguous at times, right? So maybe the question is, what grammar can you use to help you through ambiguity that's not about control or maybe coming out of fear? But didn't someone say something about what is it that gets rid of, casts out all fear?
Perfect love.
Perfect love. Right? There's not Bonaventure's on about that. I'm not, sorry?
Booze.
That's a quick one.
The wine of the Spirit, I think, is what you meant to say.
But can I say something about this? I thought about areas in which my Christian theology explicitly does kick in.
Yeah.
And I think it kicks in with providence. That's why I'm fundamentally not afraid of ambiguity, because I actually think God has the ambiguity, that underneath are the everlasting arms. And that worldview is enormously helpful to me, that because it's ambiguous and because I'm lost, doesn't mean it's lost.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And I think as Christians we can really say that.
Well, we might get to that later on, but I think character is the thing that holds all that together. So we might at some point talk about predestination and a different view on that, but I'd want to ground that in character. I think character underlies design as well, but kind of some great ideas before we get there. Is that okay? Wonderful. Hang on to them, so we'll certainly come back.
I'll forget them, I can't.
No, don't. Okay, so what I want to do, when do we close off here? We're done now, or?
Whenever you like.
Well, why don't I go just for another maybe 15 minutes, and this should be just by way of revision, because I'm revisiting some stuff that Edwin Judge talked about. So, were you all here for the Edwin Judge series? Boy, they're really worth listening to. I just probably listened to those 6 or 7 times each, almost memorised them. Very, very helpful. Edwin, as you know, is a classicist. So he spent, metaphorically, 70 years in the ancient world. People like me, Bible and theology folks, we go to the ancient world on 30-day tourist visas, and we take selfies in front of monuments that vaguely remind us of ourselves, and that's not very helpful understanding. So to have someone who's actually lived in that world is useful. So the Jerusalem versus Athens model, I think, is a good biblical one, because it takes the view that cities are iconic of their culture, and that goes all the way back from the founding of the first city, Cain. We don't have time to talk about that. But the biblical pattern is to talk about cities, right? So the city of God, Zion, the city of the great king, over against Memphis, over against Thebes, Ashur, Tyre, Sidon, Babylon, etc. So good biblical ground, I think, for doing this. We're not the first to have to do with this question. Antiochus Epiphanes, or Epiphanes, name means God manifested one. As Gordon used to say, anyone who calls himself that is bound to be a mess of trouble. And the thing that I want to draw attention to here is we're not the first people to recognise there's a profound incompatibility between these two worldviews. This didn't emerge in the first century. It's already happening in the 2nd century BC. And the thing I want to draw attention to is really the work of a chap called Giuseppe Veltri, I should say, who wrote a book called Books and Libraries in the Ancient World or something. And I think it's around about page 270. One of those little bizarre factoids you remember, and completely useless. I don't know why. But he makes the point that the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, is actually an act of cultural resistance. Because Alexander's turning up, and Alexander wants to create one new humanity, and Hellenism is going to be the cultural framework in which that happens. So Alexander has a collection of gods, 12 great Greek gods. He has a model city. You can see them strewn all over the Near East if you go out there and visit, as long as IS hasn't gotten to them. Right? And he has a canon of texts. And Veltri argues that what's going on in the translation of the Septuagint is there are faithful Jews going, no, there's another God, unlike any God you've seen. There's another city. It's Jerusalem, Zion, the city of the great king, and there's another canon of texts. All right, so I simply want to make that point for us to realise that long before people thought of Christianity, there was already a sense in Jewish history that they were on about a very different narrative. So when the gospel comes into the Greco-Roman world, it's not just a matter of let's go to the temple of Zeus, take down that billboard and put temple of Jesus. So Kevin Rowe makes this point in his book on Acts, World Upside Down. Why is it that wherever the Christians go in Acts, they get into trouble over all kinds of things? And his answer is they're actually promoting a grammar of life. So footnote there, I think it's a real mistake to see Christianity as religion. When I'm in China, that's one of the first things I tell these students. The first mistake you can make is to think of Christianity as a religion. No one in the ancient world thought they were practicing religion. That word's a modern conceit. It's impossible to define as far as I know. No one's ever really defined it. I think grammar of life is a much better way of talking about it because it's far more comprehensive. And that's what was going on in Acts. I would argue the gospel was designed to overthrow the ancient world. That's what it was designed to do. Now, how does that happen? Well, Edwin has helped us see this. These are some of these terms are mine. I think Edwin gives 3 lectures but I think he's probably covering 6 topics. I've heard that it's not good to try and put words in Edwin's mouth. He'll refute every one of them, so I won't do that. But, you know, just by way of revision, you might remember that for the Hellenistic world, the cosmos was perfect, eternal, and of course cosmos, some of you are wearing it on your face. It's what makes you look beautiful, right? So the experience of beauty and unchanging, you look up at these stars, they're perfect, they're glorious. The world around you is broken and full of change. So you've got this perfect, eternal, unchanging, beautiful thing. And the way you get access to it is through rationality. We'll come to that in just a moment. And then Jerusalem says, no, creation's good. Probably said this a few times, Tony has too, I guess. That's a phenomenal move. Because in a perfect world, nothing can ever change. Because the moment it changes, it's no longer perfect. Right? So you've seen Groundhog Day?
Yeah.
Imagine living in that, really, which is what you would be doing in the Hellenistic world, right? Nothing could ever really happen. It had already happened. Right? Now, over against that, creation is good, and that means, I think, gifted with change. It's good for its purpose, to enable flourishing, those kinds of things. So yeah, in a sense, earthquakes are good. You've got to have earthquakes, right? Because if you didn't, we'd all be under 6 inches of water. All the mountains would have been washed away. Right? You've got to have a mountain building process. And part of that involves earthquakes. So if you want to have a good, dynamic, flourishing planet, that's just part of the deal. Right? And to have that, you've got to have a rotating core, but that core is what protects you from all these heavy particles from the sun. So it might require some rethinking what goodness means and some of the implications of that. Right? That's just a thought, but gifted with change is the main one. Now, if it's a rational universe, right, then the way you get to know it, obviously, is through reason. Now, this will take a little longer explanation, but you're trying to make sense of the world, trying to get a foothold somewhere, and you don't have revelation. This is why Israel never goes down this road. They never have to. Right? They've experienced this God. They've seen him control the world. They've seen the plagues. They've crossed the Red Sea. They don't have the kinds of angst that Hellenism has. Hellenism has to make sense of the world, and you know, you look at Homer's gods, and after a while you wonder, my goodness, are they much help? You know, just Greeks on steroids, very large Greeks, not a happy thought for many people. So Parmenides, the guy you sprinkle on your pizza, okay, he, if it's true, it can't change. That's the fundamental assumption. It's true, it can't change, and anything that changes is not real. Got that? If it's true, it can't change. That makes sense, right? And anything that changes is not real. So the only thing that doesn't really change is these perfect ideas we have in our heads, this rationality. And the underlying assumption behind that, as Edwin points out, is that it's a stunning idea, stunning act of imagination. The world is rational. It just happens to be wrong. And by that, we don't mean that the world is unintelligible. Yes, the world is intelligible. You can make sense of it. The difference between intelligible and rational is where you start. Intelligible means you start with the world and let it tell you what it is. And you can make sense of that if you listen to it. Rational means I know what it looks like before I get there. So even though Aristotle is supposed to be the one who looks at the world around him, look at the explanations that he gives. They're never really tested. As long as it sounds reasonable, it must be right. But that's not how science works. Something's not right because it's reasonable. It's right because that's actually what's going on. So I just would encourage you to do that. It can happen so often. I can fall into it. It sounds reasonable, therefore it must be true. No. Right? Just because it sounds reasonable doesn't mean that's actually what's going on. That's why you're constantly looking for evidence. You want to test stuff. So when someone makes a claim, how do you know that? Where's that evidence coming from? Is it just a figment of your imagination? Is it nice speculation, or is it actually grounded in something? Now, that's critical for how you see God. We'll come to that in just a moment. But for them, logos actually is more a mathematical term. Really important to get that right. We think of logos as word, and we tend to think literature. That's not what logos means. Logos is much more a mathematical, rigid, rational system. Right? So, and that's what you're going to get if something can't change. That's exactly where you're going to go once you start thinking in those categories. On the other hand, if the world is full of change, you don't know in advance what's going on. You have to pay attention, you have to look at it, right? So emphasis on the senses and testing. There's a woman, Yael Avrahami, wrote a book called The Senses of the Bible, a female Jewish scholar. And in this book, she just points out what an important role the senses play in the Hebrew Bible, and especially in knowing God. It's remarkable. Go back to the Exodus and read how often Israel's told to see, right? And reminded, you yourselves saw, you yourselves heard. That is not speculation. It's based on experience, right? They're not guessing. They're not working their way up from, foundational principles to what God must be like and filling in all the gaps, right? They're not doing that. It's based on experience. Right? God says to them, test me, see if you don't obey what will happen. If you do obey, see what I'll do for you. I'm going to test you as well. Out of that, whoops, that thing, if I touch it, I can draw pictures. So be careful, I'm thinking now, aren't all these crazy pictures. I feel like a kid now.
I can't save you.
So, if you
I can't save you. I don't know how to stop it.
watch this.
Very creative.
Right, it's going to go.
Did you change colour?
So, I mean, if you start with those preceding views, you end up with necessarily your God has to be the product of reason. And we'll say a bit more about this next time we get together. But if you start with reason, you have two options. It's either deterministic, which is where the Stoics go, where nothing can change, or it's completely random, and it's Epicureanism. And they're kind of the two options our modern world faces. If you follow just reason, that's what you end up with. A totally deterministic world, or a world in which everything is random. And there's no real place in between. Okay? And mostly it's speculative, because you're starting from where you are, and if you're going to start with those tools, then there's no way of escaping those outcomes. Those outcomes are going to be the consequence of starting here. They will just necessarily follow. Once you go down that road, you don't get off it. That's where it takes you. On the other hand, if you're dealing with a God that you know through the senses, right, what you get in Israel's narrative is a personal God who's not human, unlike all the other gods of the ancient world, various forms of humans. This God's not human, but also, unlike those gods, deeply interested in what humans do. Constantly interested in why we act the ways we do. And that's not part of the ancient world. And it's a self-disclosure that's experienced. And that's still there. It should have gone away. It's not. Well, that's going to lead to the kind of cities you operate in. So if you go to the first option, hierarchical, aristocratic, static, no real change. Right? On the other hand, if you buy the model that's good, where God is relational, then you end up with cities that are much more dynamic, that have to do with gift and merit. So Paul takes that model from the ancient world, the body politic. And for them in the ancient world, it was the aristocrats up the top. Remember that kind of great chain, right? The step ladder we had? God at the top, and then the elite men. That's the Hellenistic world. But for Paul, Christ is the head, and everything else is gift. Which is why, by the way, I'm more than happy to have women in ministry and leadership, and one day we'll even have one who heads up the Pentecostal Church of Australia. That would be great. God so wishes. It's a matter of gift, by the way, not democracy. Okay, so from that world then, eternal soul trapped in a tomb-like body, so that's the great battle between the body and the soul. On the other hand, Christians, the body and the soul belong together, and we don't mean by soul what they mean. I think the best definition for me of soul in the biblical sense is lifedness. Lifedness. Sorry about that dreadful word. It's got nothing to do with substance. It's not eternal. I don't think that's a Christian view. It's the difference between me now and 5 minutes from now and have a heart attack and I'm lying flat on the floor, having departed. Okay? Now I'm going through this quickly, but I do want to get to one very short clip after this and then we're done. So, that world, virtue ethics, virtue, as Evan explained, virility, Homeric hero, masculine, buffed up. You've all seen Brad Pitt, haven't you? Troy. Okay, women, now be honest. Tappity tap, 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 hey, right, okay. He's actually getting older too.
He's very old now.
Very unchristian of him, very unchristian. So buffed up, powerful, and there's one guy who appears in one of the Homeric narratives who's an ordinary guy, and he gets treated like junk. How dare you speak? And he looks ugly. And you know, to be honest, there's not too many Brad Pitts in this room. Right, so truth to tell, in the ancient world, most of us men wouldn't have much status. Right? We don't look the part. Sorry, guys. Ethics, I think, is Aristotle's response to these Homeric heroes trying to do their thing. So ethics is essentially nothing to excess. So justice in that world is not what we would think justice. For us, justice is everyone being treated equally. Justice in that world is making sure the elite retain their elite status. Because they're elite based on the logos. The rationality of the universe has expressed itself in these people being elite. So to do justice is to maintain their position. Right? So when somebody who's not elite, is in some way damaged or abused by an elite male, there's no way there's going to be any kind of thing we call justice. That would be irrational. It would be immoral. That's why compassion is actually seen as immoral. Now, it's a female virtue, but then, we're all convinced that women aren't really human anyway, so if you're living in that world. Over against that, what do Christians do? Well, we do trust, hope and care. Now, two things I want to pick up on very quickly. Reality is rational and change is problematic. That's the Hellenistic view. Right? So that's what the Logos is about. I think. Great. It's a sign I need to stop, I think. So this is Chrysippus. There will never be anything new. Everything is repeated down to the minutest detail. On the other hand, for Jerusalem, reality is what is. Change is a gift, right? So this is why we get Chagall, which we never would have got, I don't think, in the Greco-Roman world. Right? We just would have had these forever. Lord have mercy. Right? And then over against that, I make all things new. Right? Hope and joy. Hope and joy are not terms you tend to find in Hellenistic philosophy. Certainly not joy. Okay? So I have one last clip to show you. I'm not being partisan. Yes, I know I have an Apple computer and I used to work for IBM and now I have seen the light. That's all true, I get that. Okay? No. I just want you to watch this clip related to design thinking. Right? And listen to the language and ask yourself where this terminology comes from in terms of the two paradigms we set before you, Athens and Jerusalem, right? Just ask yourself, based on what you might know. Okay? So, can we have some lights, please, Tony? Still up there.
Good boy.
Oh, you knew that all along.
So good.
Sorry about that. Sorry, that language.
Yes, that's awesome.
Feel. Delight, choice, joy, love, surprise. You realise that's all Christian language, right?
I don't hear it in church very often, those things.
No, we don't, which is an interesting point, I think, right? But, think of the creation narrative. We'll talk about this next time we get together. It doesn't start with good and evil, and yet many Christians do. Maybe that's one of the false steps we take. Where does the creation narrative begin?
Goodness.
Yeah, and how would you define that? Life out of
Nothing.
chaos, right? Okay. I have a friend who argues that evangelism is making meaning of people's lives. Okay. And that's really what design is about. And one of the ways of translating the word Eden, which is the garden in which God puts us?
The love.
Delight, right? So maybe we can just go with this as we go home, just to think about it. This idea, by the way, perfect, this is a verb, not a noun, so it's to do with iterative creation and development. You're not looking for the final perfect form, you're moving toward it. And that's going to keep changing depending on your context. Right, so every time you design something, it'll change the world, and in changing the world, what you've designed for it, in a sense, is going to actually change the world in such a way that your design will have to change later. Isn't that? So this is a constant dynamic process going on. So what that means, I think, for, say, churches, a church that might have worked 30 years ago is probably not going to work now. Not if it's done its job in changing the world around it. Right? If it's changing the world around it, it's going to have to change as well, to take into account that change, I think. Surprise, that's one of the most constant words in terms of people's response to Jesus. They're surprised, astonished by what they see. Okay? Love, connection, intention. That doesn't make a lot of sense in the Greco-Roman world. All a Stoic is doing is trying to learn to adapt himself. Not sure women could be Stoics, but at least men can, elite men. They're simply adapting themselves to the Logos. That rationality that's already inherent in the universe that's going to do its thing. And if you want to be at peace, you simply need to learn to conform to that. So people could recognize there's a rationality of the universe. You can see that there's order, right? But there's other things that don't make sense. People get sick, accidents happen, and they will call that fortuna. Okay? What the Stoic has to learn to recognize is fortuna is itself an expression of the Logos. Right? So when you go to the doctor and discover you've got stage 4 cancer of some kind, the true Stoic will recognize it's okay, that's just the Logos working itself out. When your 3-year-old granddaughter runs across the road and gets run over by a bus, as a true Stoic, the right response is to say, that's just the Logos. That's the order of the universe. How would you ever get humanitarian agencies in that setting? Where would you ever find language like innovation or transformation? And we don't. So, as Tony would tell you, probably told you before, it's actually the gospel that opened up the design space in our world.
But
that actually made strategy something
I've
new.
heard churches say
Yeah.
that sort of thing, when it happens to the 3-year-old granddaughter, it's God's will.
Yeah.
Like we're back there.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, exactly. Maybe we can have a session and talk about that. What do you do with suffering? I think the problem with that approach is people end up telling lies either about God or suffering or both when they do that. Right? So we can talk about what I think a Christian view of providence might be. But yeah, I mean, the extent to which we've been shaped by this. Right? So I think there's a combination. Try to just... two things to finish with. I understand design to be a mindset, not a method. And a mindset means a whole transformation of the way that you live. And that the Stoics knew, as did the Christians, that you could never actually know the truth of Stoicism, right, unless you committed to it entirely. You couldn't stand outside Stoicism and assess it until you actually got into it, right? And that makes sense. You can lie beside the swimming pool, you know, kicking your legs, flailing your arms about, and that's not swimming, right? We actually have to throw you in, and it's a life and death situation, but that's what swimming is, right? It's like marriage. Maybe not life and death, but, you know, you don't know what that is until you're in it, right? And Christianity said the same thing. Right? You cannot assess the truth of this thing from the outside. It's not that kind of thing, right? And that changes the grammar. The grammar of life, it seems to me, in all kinds of ways, because, you know, it's not asking for blind faith, but it's not that you get to sort everything out before you jump in. You have to jump in. Right? That's what design is about. So I will sometimes have students in my classes for whom their Christian life is kind of anemic, and usually my guess is that's because they haven't bet the farm yet. Right? Understand that expression? Bet the farm?
Bet the farm.
Yeah, I think if someone's got a pretty anemic Christian life, it's because they haven't actually really believed in Jesus yet. Right? They're doing something else alongside that. And the Stoics and early Christians, you had to actually jump right in. That's what the mindset thing is about, right? It's got to be who you are, and it's much more dynamic and organic. And I can't remember what the second thing was, but that's okay. It's probably time for us to go. All right, so that's going to get us started, and then we'll just share some of these thoughts next time we get together.
Which is...
So any questions or comments before we go?
When is our next one?
Tony knows.
Oh, no, I don't.
As I said, Tony knows.
First week of September. I mean, whatever it is.
Okay.
First week. September's over.
I think it is the first one. No, we've got two.
So whose child is that?
Series for you.
Jerusalem's or Athens? Whether they know it or not. Okay, bless you folks. Can I pray for you? So let me pray for you as we go our way. Father, we do thank you for your great love for us. We thank you for the incredible liberating power of the gospel that actually has offered us genuine transformation. The world can be different. Tomorrow does not have to be the same as today. And Lord, you've actually given a major part of this into our hands. It's an incredible thing. It is indeed a holy moment. And Lord, central to all of that, handling this freedom, is to imitate your character. It's the only way, Lord, that we can be designers, and we all are, in a way that brings flourishing to others, is that we imitate who you are. And Father, the only way that can happen is through the indwelling power of the Holy Spirit. So I pray for my good brothers and sisters that you will fill them abundantly with the presence of your Spirit. Help us to learn, Lord, that the Christian life is not a matter of self-discipline, improving our virtues, working on our ethics. It's never been that. It's always been about the transforming work of your Holy Spirit indwelling this image. So I pray this for my good friends in Jesus' strong name. Amen. Amen. Ciao. See you later.
So I think it's the first week of November. Friday, first Friday.
Thank you for that invitation.
I know!